degree in psychology. Then I did my graduate work at Michigan State University, where I got a master's degree in clinical psychology and then a PhD in clinical psychology.
When did you obtain your PhD in clinical psychology?
In 1981.
Have you been published?
Yes. I've published over 80 pieces in scientific journals, and I've been the editor of 2 scientific journals, both of which I started, the second one of which was the first scientific journal on psychological trauma published by the American Psychological Association.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. When you say you published over 80 pieces, does that include books, or does that mean articles?
I'm thinking specifically of articles in professional scientific journals. In addition, I authored a book on treating people who grew up with extensive child abuse trauma, and I've edited 2 books. Those are books where various chapters are written by various experts on that topic. So one book was on trauma practice in the wake of the September 11th disaster, and the other was on trauma among people with serious mental illness.
And the 2 scientific journals, you said you founded one of them, is that right?
I actually founded both of them. The first one I co-founded with a colleague at the university. That was the Journal of Trauma Practice. And the second one, which is called Psychological Trauma, is a journal published by the American Psychological Association. They asked me to start up and edit that journal. So I edited that journal for the first 6 years that it was published.
Other than your teaching at Nova Southeast University, have you taught any seminars or other things like that?
I'm regularly invited to do trainings for psychotherapists across the country. I've done some trainings in other countries, including Spain and Canada. And actually in this October I've been invited to do some training in Bogota, Colombia.
Your Honor, at this time I would offer Dr. Gold as an expert in the field of psychology and also more specifically in the field of trauma research and treatment.
No objection. He'll be, his testimony to be evaluated by the jurors, given the weight of disease they determine.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you tell the jury what trauma is in the context that you study and treat it?
Trauma is very specifically defined as a specific kind of event. A traumatic event is one where one is either subjected to the possibility of death or witnesses someone dying or facing threat of death, where there's a threat of serious physical injury either to the person themselves or witnessed, or there's some type of sexual violation. So that covers the territory of what's considered a traumatic event. Things get somewhat confusing in that we talk about trauma both as the event and the result of the event, long-lasting difficulties that people have emotionally, behaviorally, psychologically because of traumatic events. So we try and use the word traumatization to refer to the effects to distinguish it from the event. But those three areas, death, serious physical injury, sexual violation, encompass the definition of a traumatic event.
When you talk about that you study and treat trauma, do you mean the effects of trauma?
That's right.
And does that encompass all types of trauma, and by that I mean physical as well as emotional or mental trauma?
Yes.
And I guess I jumped the gun a little bit. Is all trauma physical injury?
No.
What other types of trauma are there?
Well, if someone believes that they're under the threat of death, whether they're actually assaulted or not, if they believe that death is imminent, that someone may be harming them and may create serious physical harm, this is what terrorism trauma is about, is frightening people into believing that harm could befall them at any minute.
Were you retained by the defense in Bessman Okafor's case?
Yes, I was.
And what was your understanding of the reason you were retained? For what purpose?
To assess Bessman and examine his history and see if he had a history of traumatic events and resulting traumatization.
And did you conduct such an evaluation?
Yes.
Is that something that you have done before?
Yes, it is.
Is it a regular part of your clinical practice?
It is.
Is it something that you do as a precursor to treating a person?
Yes.
And is it also something that you have done as part of your research practice?
Yes.
Is it something that you train others to do in your capacity as a professor?
Yes, it's a major focus not only of my classes but of the trauma clinic that I run.
Can you give any kind of estimate on the number of evaluations you've done in your career?
Hundreds, if not into the thousands, personally, and not including the many students that I supervise, where I'm secondhand kind of looking over their shoulder and advising them on the evaluations that they're doing.
Okay. So the hundreds, if not thousands, would be just the evaluations you've done yourself?
Yes, certainly hundreds that I've done myself.
And then you also observe students of yours conducting evaluations?
Yes, and oversee the evaluations that they do and the treatment that they do.
Can you explain the difference between a clinical evaluation and a forensic evaluation?
A clinical evaluation is one that's usually done for treatment purposes or to guide another professional in how to help somebody with their psychological difficulties. A forensic assessment is specifically for the purposes of expert witness testimony in court.
And your evaluation of Mr. Okafor was a forensic evaluation?
That's correct.
Can you describe the what materials, if any, you were provided to assist you in the evaluation?
I received school records from Mr. Okafor, prison records, records of his mother's legal records relating to Mr. Jeffers, who sexually assaulted Mr. Okafor. Those are the ones that stand out off the top of my head.
When you say mother's legal records, do you mean her criminal history, her criminal files?
It included, I believe, both criminal and civil. There were records relating to the divorce as well as criminal records.
And did you interview Mr. Okafor in conjunction with your evaluation?
Yes, I did.
On how many different occasions did you interview Mr. Okafor?
2.
Do you know how much time you spent with him in total?
Altogether, about 8 hours.
And did you interview any other witnesses?
Yes.
Who were they?
I interviewed his mother, Catalina, and his brother, Trevor. I'm sorry, his brother,
Is it Trenton?
Brent.
Or Brenton? Trenton?
yes.
Did others of the actual documents that you obtained contain narratives from various people?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what an ACE study is?
The ACE study is a very large-scale study, usually in psychology or psychiatry. We might have 50, 100, perhaps up to 500 people participating in a study. This was a study where the researchers tried to get the cooperation of everybody who was receiving their medical services from Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest medical providers in California. And they secured the participation of over 17,000 subjects. So this is a very large-scale study which helps to support the validity of the study. And the way the study came about was the lead researcher, a physician, was running a weight loss program with the idea that...
Let me stop you just for a
Yes.
second. I think might make it easier. Can you describe just very briefly what it is a study of?
Okay, sorry. So the term ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So what the researchers were interested in was interviewing these 17,000 people on their general medical history and these adverse childhood experiences to see if there were long-term effects on these people of adverse childhood experiences they might have had. The average age of the people in the study was in their 50s, so when they were asked about their adverse childhood experiences, we're talking about experiences they'd had decades earlier. And so, in effect, when they found a relationship between these experiences and current difficulties, we're talking about difficulties that were still impacting these people decades after they had lived through these things as children.
Did you utilize the results and the methodology of the ACE study to assist you in evaluating Mr. Okafor?
I did.
Did you, in fact, follow the protocol of the ACE study in evaluating Mr. Okafor?
Yes, I did.
Let's get a little more into detail about what the ACE study is. I interrupted you. You said it was a study of 17,000 or so subjects?
That's right, over 17,000.
And who conducted the study?
The study was conducted by a group of physicians and psychiatrists. It was funded by the Center for Disease Control. The initial interest in this study, as I was saying before, came about because the lead researcher was conducting a weight loss program with the idea that being overweight is a risk for various medical disorders. And so the idea was that if they could successfully help people lose weight and keep the weight off, that they would be healthier going forward. There was one particular woman in the study who was very successful in the program. She lost 50 pounds within 3 months. And she came to the attention of
Let me object to the relevance of this level of detail and not respond to the question.
it explains how the study got to the point it is at, and if we can go on a little bit further, I think it'll be clear that...
Overruled. I'll let you go. Let him give him a little leeway.
So to make this as quick as I can, this woman lost 50 pounds within 3 months, and then in the next 2 months gained it all back. So the lead researcher was very interested, or the doctor running the program was very interested with the idea that here we can help people to be successful, and yet if all their gains are reversed very quickly, we need to find out why. He sat down with this woman and said, you know, you were so successful, how do you explain that you gained back the weight so quickly? And she said, well, I feel much more comfortable when I weigh more because I was sexually abused as a child.
Let me object. Again, this is not relevant to this case, and it's the detail that there's no bearing on it.
Let's move on. Let's move on. He's explained the study.
I'm sorry?
He's explained the study.
Well,
Let's move on.
Can I proffer his answer, Your Honor?
At a break.
I'm sorry?
At a break, you can
Okay,
proffer his
yes, Your
answer.
Honor. Was the gist of this early researcher's experience with this woman a realization that childhood trauma led to long-term health consequences?
Yes.
And am I correct in understanding that it had been known that the effects of childhood trauma do have long-standing effects as an adult?
That's correct.
Was the sort of aha moment with this researcher that emotional trauma actually had physical effects as
Yes,
an adult?
the aha moment was that these experiences could not only cause psychological difficulties, but actually could also cause medical difficulties as well.
And was that the genesis for the ACE study?
That's right.
And did the researchers conducting the ACE study eventually identify a list of significant traumas that they thought were particularly relevant?
Yes, what their findings showed was that they were able to identify 10 adverse childhood experiences that had lasting psychological but also lasting medical effects. And this was the reason that the Center for Disease Control agreed to fund the study, because of their concern that these factors could lead to long-term health problems. And so if identifying them and trying to prevent them would have a significant effect on the health status across the country.
And you mentioned that these 10 adverse childhood experiences had long-standing medical effects, psychological effects.
That's right.
And also behavioral effects.
That's right.
And I assume these were adverse consequences of these 10 adverse childhood
Yes.
experiences. Were there any positive consequences of these adverse childhood experiences?
No.
When was this study completed, the initial study?
The initial study was completed in the late 1980s. There's been since there are so many people participating in the study and they collected so much data, they've published over 20 articles stemming from the study in scientific journals, and there are other people who've carried this research forward. So I believe there are around 250 studies published in total between the people who originally, the investigators who originally did the research and other investigators who are following up on what they found.
When the study was initially published, was it in a peer-reviewed journal?
Yes, all of those articles that I'm referring to are in peer-reviewed scientific journals.
And can you explain what that means?
In order to assess whether a study is sound, before it's published in a professional scientific journal, the editor sends out the manuscript to various experts in the field to look over the article to assess whether there are holes in it, whether it seems to be a sound study. Most frequently, those reviewers will send back recommendations for the author to fine-tune the paper, to correct any errors that they find, so that it's only published if the reviewers and the editor feel that it's scientifically sound and once those revisions have been made.
And so the fact that it is published in a peer-reviewed article in and of itself would indicate that the editors of that publication found it to be valid.
That's correct.
And then is there another step in sort of the validation process once a study like this is published?
Well, once a study like this is published, other researchers will go and investigate further. Do the findings replicate? If we go out and study this again, do we get the same findings when we collect information from other people?
Let me stop you there for a minute. Is that an important point, that the study be able to be replicated?
Yes, it is.
Is that sort of the cornerstone of the scientific method?
Yes, it's a basic principle in science that if the findings are sound, somebody else should be able to conduct the same or a similar study and come up with the same results.
To give an example I think everybody knows about, there was a study years ago in the Lancet, I think, that connected autism with immunizations, correct?
Purported to, claim to, yes.
And then how was that discredited?
Well, as other researchers investigated whether that was the case, they were unable to replicate the findings of the original study. So it seemed that the findings didn't hold up over repeated examination and weren't accurate.
What about the ACE study with these 250 or so articles that have reviewed it? Did any of those find any evidence that the study results were not valid?
No.
Did all of those articles support the conclusions of the ACE study?
Yes.
Are the conclusions of the ACE study widely accepted in the field of psychology?
Yes, they are.
Is that just in this country?
No, it would be around the world.
Are some of those 250 other peer-reviewed articles you mentioned articles that are published in other countries?
Yes.
Are there various researchers around the world who are actually using the ACE study for practical purposes?
Yes.
For instance, you mentioned the CDC.
The CDC funded the study. Again, their concern was that ultimately we're talking about health problems. So one of the findings of the study is that someone with 4 or more of these 10 experiences in their background, on average, had a life expectancy almost 20 years less than someone with none of them in their background. So the impact obviously was very dramatic.
So 4 or more of these adverse childhood experience equated to an average 20-year shorter lifespan.
Yeah, just less than a 20-year shorter lifespan compared to someone with none.
Did some of the other studies that have followed the ACE study find connections between the 10 adverse childhood experiences and other things besides health consequences?
Yes, the original study and the subsequent study found both psychological consequences and health medical consequences.
Did you evaluate Bessman Okafor to determine whether he had been exposed to any of these 10 adverse childhood experiences?
Yes, I did.
And what was your conclusion?
That he was...
Your Honor, could we approach?
You may. Please proceed.
Thank you.
Mr. Knocker? Mr. Knocker? Just so you don't have to run back and forth, okay.
Try not to make it happen.
Okay, that's okay. I was trying to make it easier for you.
Okay, let me rephrase the last question. Did you make a determination, do you have an opinion as to whether Bessman Okafor was subjected to any of the 10 adverse childhood experiences identified in the study?
Yes, I do.
And what's your opinion?
That out of the 10 factors, 9 of them were things that he experienced during his childhood.
Is one of the factors the loss of a parent to death, divorce, or separation?
Yes.
Is there a difference in the severity of that factor depending on whether it was death, divorce, or separation of the parent?
Well, the research didn't examine that. In particular, what they were looking at generally was whether a child before they were 18 years old, lost a parent either through death or through losing contact with the parent. One would imagine that the
Objection to counsel, to the witness's imagination. Don't think he's qualified to imagine.
Overruled. He can explain.
Thank you.
it would vary from one individual to another, but certainly one would imagine that a parent dying and so there's, that relationship is over. There's no possibility of, well, maybe in the future that parent will come back, can have a more intense effect than a parent moving away after a divorce, and the child hoping, well, maybe someday I'll be able to reunite with that parent.
So is it your professional opinion then that of the three, the death of a parent would make that a more substantial factor?
Well, certainly it was a substantial factor for the defendant. Not only did he speak to that, but his mother told me that.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Let me move on to the next one. Is childhood physical abuse one of the 10 factors?
Yes, it is.
Do these factors, I have them listed in a particular order, but is the order important as
No,
far
it's
as the
not.
study goes?
It's not.
In other words, the ones listed at the top aren't more important than the ones listed at the bottom?
No, each of them has they all lead to similar effects, both psychological and medical, and it's not necessarily as if one carries a bigger effect than the other.
Okay. Although do I understand correctly that some of these 250 studies that have resulted from the original ACE study focus on particular factors or particular consequences?
Well, a lot of these factors, like childhood physical abuse, certainly there were studies before the ACE study that looked at these factors individually. One of the points that the lead researcher on the ACE study made was that when you look at them together, instead of just how does child physical abuse affect a child, or how does growing up with domestic violence affect a child, that what you see is that it's not just physical abuse causes this, domestic violence causes that, but as he said in one of his articles, a child doesn't grow up with an alcoholic parent or with domestic violence in an otherwise well-functioning household. In other words, these are not just factors that cause problems, but also markers that suggest the more of them that there are in the person's childhood, the less likely that they're growing up in the kind of family that are going to support effective development, the less likely that the person is going to arrive in adulthood a fully functional person.
I see. So, and I'd gotten off, okay, we're listing, I'd gotten to the second factor, and you're saying they are in no particular order as
Right.
far as importance.
Right.
And so childhood physical abuse, is it your opinion that that factor was present in Mr. Okafor's childhood?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to the severity of the presence of that factor in his childhood as compared to the norm?
Objection. There doesn't appear to be any expertise in this witness's background to answer that question.
May I approach to respond, Your Honor?
Yeah, I need your approach, please.
Is it bad that I didn't?
My
even hear
keeper's
it?
over, this is my keeper's over here.
You testified already that you have evaluated hundreds, if not over 1,000 individuals for trauma. Is that right?
Yes.
And you've observed others that were evaluated by students of yours.
That's right.
Have you had enough experience with evaluating persons with childhood physical abuse to offer an opinion as to the level of severity of Mr. Okafor's?
Yes. As I said before, within...
May I have word out of the witness?
On that issue, you can. You may.
Doctor, what is the norm of physical abuse? Describe it for me, or is there a study that has established what is sort of the average level of physical abuse versus modest physical abuse versus severe physical abuse?
I'm sure there are studies like that. I'm not aware of any off the top of my head. However, based on my clinical experience with people whose physical abuse was serious enough to lead them into therapy, I can tell you what the norm is that I've observed over hundreds of cases.
Same objection, Your Honor. It's not relevant. There's no scientific studies that establish a norm. How this compares to the patients he's seen is not relevant.
Do you wish to argue?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Can you give an opinion as to whether the childhood physical abuse suffered by Bessman Okafor was mild, moderate, or severe?
I can say that it's more severe than what the ACE's question asks for, and that the ACE's question asks whether the person was hit, punched, slapped, and as opposed to what Mr. Okafor experienced, which was being...
Objection, Your Honor, to the witnesses giving an opinion about facts. And of course, the court's the motion in limine.
I understand. The motion in limine notwithstanding, he can answer the question at this point.
Continue.
He was beaten with an extension cord that left scars.
So are you saying then that he clearly, that factor applies to him?
Yes.
It's not a borderline case?
No, not at all.
Okay. The next factor is childhood verbal and emotional abuse. Do you have an opinion as to whether that factor existed in Mr. Okafor's upbringing?
Yes, it did.
Another factor that a household member was an alcoholic or drug user.
Yes.
And did that factor exist in Mr. Okafor's upbringing?
Yes, it did.
Is another factor domestic violence?
Yes.
What does that mean in relation to the study?
In relation to this study, the specific question is, before you were 18 years old, did you grow up in a household where your mother was treated violently, and Mr. Okafor's mother was beaten on an ongoing basis? There was
Objection, move to strike, say factual assertion. Jury's heard the evidence statement.
Your Honor, I think we both have to follow the same set of rules here. May we
Overruled.
approach?
Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Okafor's mother, and he witnessed this, was beaten on a regular basis by his stepfather, Mr. Akpan.
Is childhood emotional neglect one of the factors?
Yes.
Can you explain what childhood emotional neglect is?
Emotional neglect is growing up in a household where you don't feel loved, where there's not sufficient guidance and structure.
Was that factor present in this case?
Yes. Mr. Okafor in particular.
Objection, reproach.
You may. Please proceed.
Thank you.
Whoop, wait, hang on just a second. You okay? Okay. Please proceed.
We were talking about childhood emotional neglect. Without reference to this particular case, can you explain what childhood emotional neglect is?
Childhood emotional neglect is where the child feels unloved and unprotected by the rest of the family.
Unloved and unprotected?
Yes, or, well, either or, in some cases both.
And do you have an opinion as to whether that factor is present in Mr. Okafor's upbringing?
Yes,
And what is your opinion?
it is.
Is sexual abuse one of the factors?
Yes.
Can you define sexual abuse as used in the study?
Sexual abuse would be being subjected to unwanted sexual activity, usually by someone several years older than the child.
In fact, was there a, maybe a mistake, was there a cutoff on the age difference before the factor
I don't
can
believe
be
there was
found?
in this study. Often in the research, the way the question, the standard is that the assailant is at least 5 years older than the
Okay.
child.
Would there be any dispute in the scientific community as to whether this factor were present in the case of a 14-year-old being abused by a 33-year-old?
No, not at all.
Is physical neglect one of the factors?
Yes.
And can you describe what physical neglect means with respect to the study?
Physical neglect is not consistently being provided with adequate basic necessities like food, shelter, medical care.
Do you have an opinion as to whether this factor was found in this case?
Yes,
And what's your opinion?
it was.
You mentioned lack of medical care.
Yes.
Assuming a hypothetical where a 14-year-old was sexually abused and was offered counseling but did not get it because his mother didn't arrange it and he didn't want it, 14-year-old, would that be evidence of physical neglect?
Yes.
And is another factor that a household member was incarcerated?
Yes,
Was that factor present in Mr. Okafor's upbringing?
it was.
And I think is the only remaining factor.
Objection, Your Honor. Could we approach on that last factor?
You may. Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Is the last of the 10 factors that a household member was chronically depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal?
Yes.
Did that factor exist in Mr. Okafor's upbringing?
That I had no way of knowing because there was no documentation that that was the case.
And I assume, well, I shouldn't assume. Can you, do you have to determine for purposes of your evaluation that the factor did not exist if you have no evidence of it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
If you have no evidence of it, then it's not a factor you consider, correct?
Well, in a forensic situation, if there isn't external corroboration, somebody may have mental disorder that has never been diagnosed or never been treated. And so in the absence of that documentation, I didn't feel like there was enough evidence to conclude that that factor was present.
Okay, so you didn't consider that factor in your evaluation, in your results?
I didn't
Didn't consider the
conclude that
existence of it.
that it was categorically present.
Okay, so bottom line is you found 9, in your opinion, 9 out of the 10 factors that are used in the ACE study were present in Mr. Okafor's upbringing.
Yes.
Do you have any idea on how common or rare that is? Is that normal to have 9 out of 10 factors?
It's exceedingly rare. So, for example, in a study of 6 out of the 10 ACE factors among over 135,000 children in the 6th, 8th, and 12th grade, 70% had none of these factors in their background. And obviously, the more factors there are in someone's background, the smaller a proportion of the general population that's going to be.
So this was a study of 135,000
Children in 6th, 8th, and 12th grade.
And there were none present in 70%.
70% of them had none of these factors in their background.
The studies seem to refer, or many, if not most of them, to people having 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those
Yes.
factors.
Yes.
And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot for people with 5 or more.
Right. In the published studies, they rarely go beyond 4 or 5 factors because we're talking about an exceedingly rare instance once you have someone who has more than 4 or 5 of these factors in their background.
Okay. Is there a baseline number of factors that need to be present before there are adverse consequences?
No, each one of these factors can lead to adverse consequences, again, both psychological and medical. But one of the important findings of this study is that there's what we call a dose-response relationship here, so that the more factors one has in one's background, the higher the risk for a wide range of problems, and the more likely those problems are to be severe. So the higher the dose of these 10 factors in someone's history, the greater the range of difficulties and the greater the severity of the difficulties.
Is there a direct relationship between the number of factors and the severity of the outcome, or is it an exponential relationship?
It's exponential.
Okay. Can you describe what that difference means?
Well, one factor, again, can lead to difficulties, but the more factors you get, because we're not just talking about this one acts in isolation, that one acts in isolation, they act in combination. So if you've got a person who has a high number of these factors in their background, it's as if they didn't have bad luck, they'd have no luck at all. That the general atmosphere in which they're growing up in is extremely detrimental to them. And certainly growing up in a household with 8, 9, or 10 of these factors is very different from growing up in a household where one of these factors is present.
Would another way of explaining it be, for instance, does 2 factors make it twice as likely to have long-term problems, or more than twice as likely?
More than twice as likely.
So 4 times the factors would not mean 4 times as likely, but a much, much higher percentage?
That's right.
Can you predict what particular adverse outcomes these factors cause?
Some factors are related more to certain adverse outcomes, but any of them can lead to a wide range of outcomes. So for example, someone who's sexually abused is more likely to have sexual adjustment difficulties and relationship adjustment difficulties in adulthood. Someone who's physically abused is more likely to have problems with aggression and controlling their impulses, but that doesn't mean, but someone who's sexually abused can also be related to a higher level of aggression. Someone who's physically abused, that can also lead to sexual difficulties. So there's a higher likelihood of certain kinds of problems related to a particular factor, but it's not limited to those problems.
And so the problems that can occur, are some of them problems that you would not necessarily expect or intuitively expect based upon the existence of a factor?
Yes.
For instance, did I read that there's a much higher risk of, is it COPD for someone who has the presence of these factors?
Right, so this is an example of how you can have various medical difficulties that are more likely to occur
Objection.
with these factors.
Relevance.
Approach. Please proceed.
Thank you. Is there a wide range of adverse consequences to the existence of these adverse childhood experiences?
Yes, there is.
Are the adverse consequences necessarily obvious based upon the particular experience or experiences that a child suffered?
No, they're not.
Is there any evidence of how long-standing the consequences are? For instance, whether they persist throughout adulthood or whether they fade over time?
Yes, again, the average age of the people in the study was in their 50s, and they were experiencing these long-term consequences at the point that they were being studied. So we're talking about a relationship between the experiences they had before they were age 18 and the consequences that they were experiencing in the present time when the study was done.
And you're talking about the initial study of 17,000 patients?
That's right.
And these were patients of this particular insurance company, Kaiser Permanente?
Yes.
Okay. So are you saying that then that the adverse consequences persisted in these people into their 50s?
Yes.
And what's the conclusion that you would draw from that as to the long-standing nature of the consequences?
That these consequences persist for decades,
Now,
for a lot of people throughout their lifetime.
with a background like Mr. Okafor's, you've already said 9 out of 10 adverse experiences extreme. Is that
Yes.
right? How certain is that this would lead to long-term adverse consequences?
Well, that question's in the abstract. I understood my charge as to see, was that in fact the case with Mr. Okafor? I mean, it would be exceedingly rare and surprising if someone grew up with 9 out of 10 factors in their background and it hadn't led to long-term severe consequences.
Now, I guess just so we're clear, you're not saying, are you, that because of the existence of these factors is the cause of Mr. Okafor's legal problems?
No.
Okay. Are you merely saying that with the number of factors present in his life, would it be fair to say he was virtually guaranteed not to be a successful adult?
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
What are the chances, given 9 out of 10 adverse childhood experiences, that Mr. Okafor could grow up to be a successful adult?
Extremely low.
Is one of the reasons that this has been studied so extensively for the purpose of helping people to be happier, healthier, more well-adjusted adults?
Yes.
Is that why an insurance company would get involved in something like this?
Yes.
And the CDC as well?
Yes.
Could I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
I'll tend to the witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Ashton, probably should give the jury a short break. Is that okay at this point?
Absolutely.
All right, folks, let me give you about a 10-minute break. We're going to try to finish with this witness this morning if we can. So a short break. If you need more time, let Jeff know. Please do not discuss the case. Do not do any research.
All right, 3 seconds.
Okay. Thank you, sir. All right, about 10-minute break, folks.